And hello, everyone. Welcome to the July 8th Comms 103 lecture. And today we're going to get started with Chapter 14. So, Chapter 14, Informative Speaking, or Speaking to Inform, whatever. So, I don't know if I can really communicate to you how teaching people is not nearly as easy as I thought it would be. San Diego State University just kind of hired me right out of the gate. I was a young, naive master's student who came in and they just went, "Hey, do you want an extra $900 a month?" And I went, "Sure." And they went, "Okay, go teach 80 first-year college students how to speak in public." And I was like, I remember failing that class, but here I am. And I had to learn quite a bit on how to actually teach, because teaching people requires not only that you deliver good information, competent information, not only that you deliver new information, relevant information that the audience hasn't already heard it before, and that the audience actually thinks that it's something important for them to know, but just like with any other form of public speaking, you have to work hard to try to keep the audience's attention throughout. That means you make your information interesting. Not only that you demonstrate why you need to know this, but why you would want to know this. So in this chapter today, we're going to cover all the basic guidelines when actually teaching the audience about something. And in doing so, our speeches are now able to be a little bit more creative, a little bit more engaging. And that's all towards the purpose of trying to get the audience to remember what we actually talked about. Because I can sit here and I can give a full hour and 15-minute lecture to all of you, but if you can't remember anything I said at the end of that lecture, or if you can't remember anything I said the day after that lecture, then what was the point? What was the point of me giving the lecture? What was the point of you sitting through the lecture? So today, we're going to talk about how to actually make our information as presentable as possible so that the audience can recall it a month, 2 months, 3 months from now. So, how many people do we got today? You know what? I'd like to try the warm-up question. I'd like to try that again because it's been a while since we've gone into breakout rooms. So, I'm going to split you up into breakout rooms. I'm just going to pair you off really quick. And the warm-up question for today is this. If you could instantly master any skill, if you could instantly get good at any one thing, well, not only get good, if you could instantly become absolutely perfect at any one skill, what would it be? Go ahead. I'm going to pair you up with somebody. Go ahead and talk about it. I think we got 2, 4, 6. I think we got an even number. So I'm going to go ahead and split you off into breakout rooms. I'm going to pause the recording, resume recording. So, there we go. Okay. So, well, before we even get started with how to teach, we have to ask the question of what do we teach? In this speech, you have to give a speech on culture. You have to try to, in just 3 to 5 minutes, cover an entire culture. That means talking about, I don't know how many people, and all the unique ways that they interact with each other, that they communicate, that they gather, that they express themselves. That's incredibly difficult to do in just 3 to 5 minutes. Think back to your speech of introduction. Did you really talk about everything about yourself using just 2 objects in 2 to 3 minutes? No, it's not really feasible. You can't teach everything to an audience, and you can't expect an audience to learn everything. So you have to ask yourself, okay, what do I want the audience to walk away with? What are the most important parts to learn and present in my speech? And a great way to answer that question is through an analogy that I call surfing, swimming, or drowning. Now, let me use an example. An example in a metaphor, if that doesn't get confusing enough. I am a huge fan of Star Trek. I am an absolutely enormous, total Star Trek nerd. I've loved it ever since I was in elementary school. I've watched every TV series. I've seen every movie. I even watched the new Star Trek show that came out in the spring that was absolutely awful, in my opinion. I'm a huge Star Trek fan. But the reality is that I can't expect everyone to be as passionate a fan as I am, right? Now let's say that I wanted to give a speech on why you should watch Star Trek. I want to give you that speech, and I really want to talk about something that really matters to me, something I'm incredibly passionate about. And I just want to try to let that passion through to my audience. Well, let's say that I just decide, you know what? If I say everything about Star Trek as quickly as possible, then the audience, even if they pick up a little bit, is more than I was expecting. And even if they get just a small fraction of the passion I have, then that's already more than they would have walked away from if I hadn't given the speech. So I can try and drown the audience. And I could say, hey, you know what? You want to watch Star Trek? Well, you're in luck because there's over 8 different series you can check out. You can watch Star Trek, the original series, which premiered in the 1960s, starring Captain Kirk. And you can also watch Star Trek The Next Generation. Star Trek The Next Generation is an 8-series TV series starring Captain Picard that was aired from the 90s to the early 2000s. Then you can check out Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Now, Star Trek Deep Space Nine is going to be different in that it's not an episodic series necessarily, in that it's got more focused around long-term plot arcs with a more dramatic, conflict-driven storyline. If you would like to return to the adventure-focused orientation of Star Trek, the original series and Next Generation, then you can check out Star Trek Voyager, although in my opinion, it's got a lower consistent episode writing. For example, a lot of the characters are more poorly developed. And you can also check out Star Trek Enterprise. Now, Star Trek Enterprise was canceled before season 3, so it's the shortest running Star Trek series, and in my opinion, that kind of hampers it a little bit, especially in terms of its long-term plot arcs. You could also watch Okay, where did I lose you? When did you stop listening to me? Right? Can anyone remember anything I just said there? You might be able to get vague snatches of, yeah, you're a Star Trek fan. Yeah, okay, I remember hearing about that one time, but none of it's actually going to get through to you. So I'm talking, and I could give an entire lecture on Star Trek right now, and I'd have a ton of fun doing it, but none of you would, one, be listening to me, because you're now bored by what I'm saying. You're confused by what I'm saying, because nothing that I'm saying actually makes sense, and it doesn't interest you. My interest doesn't already map to the audience, so you have no reason to even engage in the first place. So you want to avoid drowning the audience. But let's take it to the opposite end of the extreme. Let's say, okay, I don't want to alienate anybody. I don't want to make anyone too bored. I don't want to make anyone think I'm too big a nerd. So I'm just going to talk about the most serviceable details of Star Trek. And I'm just going to say, hey, you know what? Star Trek is a good show. It's got spaceships. It's got aliens. Sometimes they go down to different planets, and a person with a red shirt dies. It's a good show. Now, does that actually teach you anything? Does that actually teach you anything new? Not really. Because most people in this call have heard about Star Trek. It's been running for over 50 years now, 60 years. It was an incredibly popular TV show. You've all probably heard something about Star Trek at some point. And all you probably know about it is, yeah, it's about spaceships and it's about aliens. So I'm not teaching anything new. All I'm doing is just confirming what you already have been told. That's called skimming in this metaphor. By just skimming on the surface, by not going anywhere below that surface, now the audience isn't learning anything new or interesting. So you haven't actually engaged their attention either. True, everyone can follow along with you, and they can easily remember what you said, but what's the point of learning, of hearing an informative speech where you're not actually informing the audience about anything? You can extend this to a lot of culture speeches I hear for this informative speech, where all they do is just fall back on broad stereotypes that people already know. I'm going to keep bringing this up, but I hear so many speeches on Italian culture. So many times students just say, Italians have a very deep and insightful culture, and there they just go into stereotypes. They like to eat pasta, and they speak Italian, and this is their flag, and their capital is Rome, and this is an Italian building. And it's all things we know. It's all very obvious facts about the nation of Italy. You're not going beyond the surface. You're not teaching me something I don't already know. So what you want to do is you want to glide in this metaphor that's getting increasingly tortured. You don't want to go on the surface. You actually want to teach the audience something, but you don't want to go too in depth of a subject that now you've lost the audience, that now you're trying to teach them far more than they can ever absorb or want to learn. So you want to find that balance between too much information and too little. What something the audience doesn't know, but doesn't take too long to explain. What's a way to keep the audience engaged even though they've never actually experienced this culture, while at the same time not going too broad and just going through incredibly broad stereotypes. So the purpose of any informative speech, to keep in mind, is to teach the audience something new, interesting, it says or, but and useful. The audience doesn't know it or didn't know it before. The audience actually wants to learn more about it, and the audience can practically apply it to their own lives somehow. A key thing to keep in mind, though, is you want to still remain neutral on your information. You're not trying to persuade the audience to do something or not. You're not trying to tell them, hey, go out and visit this country. Go out and see this culture. Not necessarily. You want to remain neutral because you don't want to persuade the audience. I'm not necessarily trying to persuade you to do anything in this lecture. I'm just trying to present information as unbiased as possible and then see how you can apply it to your own speeches. So, now that we've covered the goals of an informative speech, we now want to talk about the types of informative speeches and what type of informative speech we'll be using in this class. First, we have 5 general types of informative speech. The first is the report. The report is a brief and concise speech, no more than 1 to 2 minutes long, that just delivers the most bullet point facts. The reason why it's so short is that it's delivered to an audience who already know what you're talking about. They already know most of what's going on, and you're only really delivering the most relevant updates. An example of a report would be a memo within a business or within a company. The memo doesn't need to reteach employees everything that the company does and everything that the company has done in the past year or so. The memo instead can just be a 1 to 2 minute speech of, okay, here's what happened this week, here's what we plan to do this next week. The reason why it's able to be, like I said, because the audience already knows about it, you don't have to bring them up to speed. You only have to teach them the most immediately useful and new information. Contrast that with the explanation. The explanation goes more in depth. The explanation is going to really dive into a specific subject and teach the audience the context, the history, the background, how it's expressed today, and so on. Your informative speech that you'll be turning in the next week is going to be an explanation. You have to go into it assuming that your audience doesn't know anything about it, because you're giving a speech to potentially 30 different people. You can't assume that they've all been exposed to this culture in some way. So that means that you really want to go in depth into how everything links together, how the history of this culture created its beliefs, which created its practices, which created its traditions, and so on. You also want to bring the audience up to speed by avoiding the use of, like we talked about last week, the use of technical jargon or words specific to that culture, without at least first explaining what those words mean. And then we can cover demonstration. A demonstration is a type of informative speech that shows the audience how to actually do something. It shows the audience by actually doing it in front of the audience. So rather than just giving a dry explanation, explaining it through words alone, if I want to try to teach you how to change a car tire, I can show you by actually changing a tire myself. A good example of a demonstration is your next activity. You have an activity due this Friday, literally called Do It Yourself, where you have to provide a demonstration speech to the audience, where you're going to show the audience how to actually do something, and then you are going to try to do something that one of your classmates has demonstrated. Rodrigo, you have your hand up?
I can demonstrate like pretty much anything.
Yep. You just want to try to keep it relatively short, and you don't want to get too technical. So for example, I wouldn't give a demonstration of how to perform open heart surgery to the class.
Okay, can I like, for example, just show the class how to assemble a skateboard?
Yep, I think that works perfectly.
Okay.
Just keep in mind that they might not be able to do it themselves then, because they might not have the tools or materials.
Okay.
Because remember that as another part of the assignment is that you also have to then do something that someone else in their speech shows.
Okay.
But yeah, that works perfectly fine. That works perfectly well.
Cool. Thanks, Professor.
Okay, so demonstrations are very effective because most people are visual learners. People need to, I, for example, need to see something being done in order to learn how to do it. If I'm going to try cooking a new recipe, I have to actually have someone there cooking it with me, or I have to at least watch a YouTube video or something. It's very difficult for someone to follow along through words alone, through just explaining it. You need to actually do. Another example of a demonstration is when I gave the lecture last week on nonverbals during public speaking. It's very difficult to try and think, okay, I have to use gestures without actually seeing what gestures in a speech actually looks like. So by demonstrating, you're providing that visual frame of reference, and it's now much easier for the audience to follow along and to do what you're trying to teach them to do, which is the goal of any informed speech. Next, we have narratives. I've stressed that narratives, stories, have a huge impact in how the audience is able to follow along with the speech. Stories are so easy to follow along because now you can have an audience identify with people, not just events. You can have them see things in a clear beginning, middle, and end. So if you're trying to teach the audience about a subject, if you can frame it as a story, now the audience can perceive it, can follow along in a much easier way. Think of how you learned history in school, or how you learn history now if you've taken a history class recently. A lot of the ways that people teach history these days is they teach it as a story. They teach it with clear characters doing things that lead to events that then introduce new characters. There's a clear beginning, middle, and end. Think of how you learn something like American history. Think of how you learned it as Chapter 1, the Pilgrims came on the Mayflower. Chapter 2, then there was an American Revolution. Chapter 3, then there was another war. Chapter 4, then there was a Civil War. Chapter 5, then there was a First World War. And you're able to follow along because now you're able to trace things as that clear story. Rather than just trying to teach you history as a series of loosely connected events, now you can string along a clear plot. So what you can do in your informative speech is you can frame your culture as a story. You can try teaching the audience about this culture by first bringing up its history, its past, how this culture came to be, how it has evolved into the culture it is now. And by doing so, by telling the history, you can say, okay, and at this point in the culture's history, it developed this practice. This practice is expressed today as such. Then in the 1970s, just an example, the culture then started demonstrating this practice, which then led to this. And now the audience is able to clearly follow it along. And the last type of informative speech we'll be covering is the comparison speech. The comparison speech essentially tries to compare two distinct concepts, lists how they are both alike and how they differ. Some good aspects of one, some bad aspects of the other. Keep in mind that it's not saying that if you're comparing two distinct things, that one thing is any better or worse than the other. Remember, you want to remain neutral on your information. All you're doing is you're saying this is A and this is B. This is how A is like B. This is how A is different from B, and so on. So a good comparison speech would be if I wanted to give a speech on how we can prevent climate change. Now, in a comparison speech, I can say, all right, so here are two distinct solutions that people have brought forward to stop climate change. One is the use of alternative fuels, such as solar energy or bioenergy, and the other is through the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. So they're trying to restrict how much carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere. I can tell you why this solution can work, why it could be, and I can tell you what's kind of stopping us from using alternative fuels. I can also tell you why it would be effective to limit greenhouse gas emissions, but I can also tell you here's what's stopping us from doing so. And by drawing those comparisons, now you let the audience decide which one they would prefer, or which is the better solution. So now that we talked about the types of informative speeches, just some general guidelines to cover when giving an informative speech. I've repeated this about 1,000,000 times, but you want to give new information. You want to try to think, all right, what's something that I didn't know before and that most likely the audience didn't know before either? Every reading discussion I've asked you, list 2 to 3 different things that you didn't know before reading these chapters. Try to ask yourself that while doing research for your topic. When you're writing down your outline, think to yourself, what are 2 to 3 things I did not know before beginning the informative speech? And then, is it likely that the audience knew them? Probably not. You also want to relate the subject matter to the audience. There's a reason I'm constantly going on tangents, giving examples, and so on. The audience might never have experienced this culture firsthand. They might have never actually seen this culture. They might not have even heard of this culture. You want to try to present it in a way that the audience is now able to relate a culture that they've never seen or been part of to their own experience. Not last week, on Monday, I used the example of bronies. I used the example of a culture of adult men who have a very big passion, who very much like a children's cartoon show aimed for little girls. We might have ever experienced brony culture firsthand. We might not have been part of brony culture, but you still have to find a way to relate to that culture to an audience's personal experience. A way you can do so is to say, hey, have you ever been so passionate about something you just wanted to show it in some way? You wanted to write about it. You wanted to create something related to it. You just wanted to talk to other people about it. Imagine being so passionate about it that you could join a community of millions of other people who are just as passionate as you about this subject. That's something we can all relate to. That's something that each of us have that distinct experience. And by relating to that common feeling, now the audience can relate to the information, and by relating to it, are much more likely to get engaged by it, because now they can apply it to their own lives. You also want to avoid data dumping. You want to avoid just throwing all of your supporting evidence at the audience at once. Remember my example of Star Trek, where I just threw 8 different kinds of Star Trek shows at you. If by throwing all that information at you, well, now it's incredibly difficult for the audience to retain any of it. By throwing all of the numbers, how am I expecting you to try to retain any one? And then we talked about this on last week. Time has no meaning. We talked about this last week, but you also want to use appropriate language. You don't want to use too many technical words, especially if you're talking about a culture. You don't want to use too many words technical to that specific field without first explaining what those words mean to your audience. You want to try speaking to your entire audience. You want to try to keep everyone engaged. So try to speak at their level. And then just some reminders, it's not due March 13th, it's due June 12th. I'll change that right after the lecture today, but it's on YouTube, so glad that's off. But again, your outline is due on June 12th, typed and written and submitted to Canvas. Obviously, it's going to be typed. I'm not expecting you to send me a written version of your outline via like snail mail. As a reminder, you're just selecting a specific topic. You've got 3 to 5 main points. The speech is supposed to be 3 to 5 minutes long. You want about 2 subpoints per main point. You want to be specific in these main points. You want to talk about specific events, specific ceremonies, specific people, beliefs, things like that. The more specific you are, the more you actually teach the audience something new, something they haven't heard of before. Just like with your speech of introduction, the key to making your body interesting is through those use of details and examples. You want to have 6 different sources of research for your outline, a minimum of 6 cited and referenced in APA format. If you're not familiar with APA, you want to recheck and review the lecture from Monday, but you need to have a minimum of 6 different sources, both cited in the text of your outline and as a reference on a separate page. You want to try to use actually credible sources. So you don't want to use Wikipedia. Wikipedia is not a credible source. It's a credible source of research to find other sources. But to just say, I got my information from Wikipedia is like saying, according to Google, this culture is the biggest culture in the world. It doesn't sound credible. It doesn't sound like you actually did substantive research. Just to remind you, if it's cited in text, if you cite the information, you say, according to Johnson, yada, 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 it needs to have a reference on a separate page. If you make it a reference, if you list it as a reference, it needed to have cited at least once in your text. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. We went over on Monday the general format of your outline. Here are just some pointers to use and just your conclusion for your informative speech outline. Again, I remind you that if you're working on any kind of if you're working on an element of your draft, you're more than welcome to send me that draft. Just try to be specific on what you'd like me to take a look at. Because if you say, here's my outline, can you give me some feedback? I can only really give you vague feedback like, oh, I think you can kind of improve your main points. The more specific you are on what you want in terms of feedback, the more specific feedback I can give. So here are just some other guidelines. Here are some guidelines for the speech itself. You don't need to get your topic approved. I really should edit this PowerPoint. Don't I just look like the most professional instructor in the world right now? You don't need to get your topic approved. You are encouraged to email me or ask me in my office hours if the topic you'd want to do works well. What's different from the speech of introduction is you will need some kind of visual aid. 9 times out of 10, this visual aid takes the form of a PowerPoint. So you will have to use at some point while delivering your speech some kind of visual aid. This can be a PowerPoint. I'm going to show you how you can use a PowerPoint during your speech. This can also be a poster board. These could be a couple of objects, like with your speech of introduction. This could be a video, so long as you use it throughout your speech, but it needs to be some form of visual aid. By providing a visual aid, now you give the audience something to focus on, especially if they've never seen a culture before. They need to know what that culture looks like. They need to know what you're talking about actually looks like. Doing so actually helps them retain the information better. Research has shown that people need a visual aid to actually create a substantial link between the information and long-term memory. So, some guidelines for a PowerPoint. If you have one, try not to read off it, because like we talked about, it affects all of your nonverbals. If you just read off a PowerPoint, it's very difficult to sound engaging, to use your hands while speaking, to try to keep your eyes focused on the camera and with your audience, as opposed to just reading off it word for word. Some elements of culture to explore as your specific main points are just some symbols of that culture, some specific language that culture might use. What does that culture value? What does that culture consider normal within their own culture? What might be the worldview of that culture? How do they see the world? What is their perspective? All of these can work as a distinct main point. You can also talk about the history of the culture as a specific main point. You can talk about the specific people in a culture, if there's any noteworthy people you'd like to discuss, and so on. All of these work as specific main points. As subpoints, you can then provide a specific example of a symbol within that culture, or a specific word they use within that culture, and so on. So now that we've covered that, I'm just going to give you a brief walkthrough of how to actually use a visual aid during your informative speech. So, can you all see me on Canvas right now?
Yeah.
Cool. So how you do that is you just click on the informative speech link where you're actually going to be giving your informative speeches on July 20th. You click that. It's going to take you to the same old, same old. Click that to load GoReact into a new window, and then click Start Assignment. Now, how you can incorporate that into your, if you're using a PowerPoint into your speech, is you then can click Add PDF Slides. Now, if you click that, and if you're using PowerPoint or Google Docs, clicking this link will show you how to convert that slideshow into a PDF file. I don't know why, but you need to convert it into a PDF file to actually use it, to upload it to GoReact. So by clicking that link, it's going to give you a full walkthrough of how to actually, by following that link, to convert your PowerPoint slides to PDF. See Microsoft's guide here. You can click that. It's going to show you how to do so. But once you've done that, once you convert your slideshow to a PDF, you then select it. I selected the wrong one. You then select it. It's going to upload. Click Start. Okay. Then you just type title, your name, you hit record, and then it's just going to say, and then while you're giving your speech, you can just go ahead and you can click this, or you can hit the space bar to change your, to change slides while speaking, okay? So you can move around the room, use your gestures, and then just when you want to change your slide, you just walk back up, you hit space bar, then you move back, and you still use your nonverbals, okay? So does anyone have any questions on that? Any of that process? Anywhere else you'd like me to walk you through again?
No.
Okay, and again, I'll be uploading this video and I'll be putting timestamps for how to specifically cut to that. I'm gonna add timestamps to the video on Monday too, just so you're able to also skip to the APA section. Okay, so I think that just about covers it. I think that covers everything we wanted to talk about today. That covers chapter 14. That covers how to use a visual aid during your informative speech. I'm going to send a few reminders over the course of the remaining week and next week just to remind you to use a visual aid. But other than that, you have a reading discussion due on Friday as well as an activity where you're giving a demonstration speech. You then have your informative speech outline due by Sunday night at 11:59 p.m. If you have any questions on any of those, feel free to either send me an email or stop at my office hours that I'll be holding tomorrow from 2 to 3 p.m. If you also can't make that time, go ahead and send me an email and we can schedule a one-on-one Zoom appointment, because I think that would also work well for a lot of people. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.